Good morning, lovely students. I don't know why I said it's morning. I'm sure you're not watching this in the morning. It is also 2 p.m. today when I'm recording this. Hello, lovely students. Today we're starting the book Mohawk Interruptus, the second book of the year. And as I said in a couple classes ago, in a lot of ways, right, Audra Simpson, the author of this ethnography, is going to unpack another dynamic of the liberal multicultural state, but this time from the perspective of indigenous studies. Excuse me. So what I'm going to do in this class is I'm going to flag some of the concepts from her book, and I'm going to unpack some of the context for thinking about how she's thinking about the state, and specifically the settler state, and how that grounds her critique of these systems. So just a little bit of context, because indigenous issues tends to be a gap within most students' educations to this point. We're going to talk a little bit in this class about what settler colonialism is and why, and we'll start theorizing that gap. It's actually a fundamental part of colonial governance, what we'll call elimination logics. But to provide just some basic context, right, this is a book about a part of the Mohawk Nation, the Ganawage Reserve. So when I use these languages, right, these terms, the Mohawk Nation is one of the nations within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is also often called the Iroquois Confederacy. So Haudenosaunee is the same thing as Iroquois Confederacy, and the Confederacy is made up of several distinct autonomous nations, of which the Mohawk Nation is one. Now, when we talk about Ganawage, we are talking about a specific reserve. When I say a reserve, I mean this is Canada's terminology for a reservation. It's the same kind of institutional thing. And Ganawage is near Montreal. And here it is on the map. The second piece is this concept that keeps coming up in Audrey Simpson's article in her book, which is sovereignty. Sovereignty is a really important concept in indigenous politics. In the same way, in black political movements in the United States, racial justice movements, there's this the importance of the concept of freedom, right, which is something that's deeply rooted in the history of slavery. In indigenous context, the kind of parallel term that organizes the values of indigenous politics and indigenous community organizing is sovereignty. Sovereignty refers to basically the values of indigenous peoples being able to self-govern, self-determine their own lives. This is different than, for example, civil rights. Sovereignty is not really only about being granted equal rights within the liberal settler state. It's about being able to maintain self-determination and self-governance. And this draws on a long history in indigenous politics of treaty making, of making treaties with European powers as legal agreements that are made on the basis of nation to nation. So the idea is that indigenous peoples are not just minorities, they are sovereign nations within settler states. Sovereignty means fighting not just for equal rights, but fighting for sovereign political rights, fighting for self-determination. And so what we have in this book, Mohawk Interruptus, is Audrey Simpson, who is a Mohawk anthropologist, writing about Mohawk politics, writing about and theorizing sovereignty and the settler state. And so when you read this, think about how this work deepens Sanjay's critique of the state, of the liberal multicultural state, as an anti-black project. Here, we're going to look at the liberal multicultural state as a settler colonial project. These are some of the kinds of big questions that the book raises. How do nations, both indigenous and settler, articulate things like membership, citizenship, and borders? She talked a lot about how Mohawk peoples debate with one another about who's considered a member, who is a proper member, who's a proper relation. She talks quite a bit about the conflicts of claiming citizenship both within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but also within Canada and the United States. And later chapters are going to focus a lot on the politics of borders and border crossing. The second question is, how do settler states recognize and misrecognize Indigenous life? How do Indigenous peoples refuse recognition by the settler state and insist on something more? Well, I'll get deeper into that in a minute. And the last piece is, how do Mohawk people navigate questions of membership and the borders of empire? And so if Sanjay gave us this concept of abolition to work with in terms of a kind of politics that was about dismantling the anti-black state, Simpson's going to give us a politics that's around what she calls refusal, an act of turning away from the settler state and insisting on other ways of organizing political life within Indigenous systems of governance. The way I frame this kind of question in my Indigenous Studies classes is essentially, what does it mean to live as ethical relations on Indigenous land? What would it mean to live within Indigenous law, not just settler colonial law? And when we talk about the conceptual interventions of this book, Audrey Simpson is developing 4 concepts and 3 claims. This is kind of how her book is organized. The issues are sovereignty, citizenship, misrecognition, and recognition. The claims are nested sovereignty, refusal, and the limits of anthropological and political science engagements with Indigenous politics. When we talk about sovereignty and what she calls nested sovereignty, we're talking about these complex considerations both of the United States and Canada as sovereign nations and the ways in which their settler nations articulate their sovereignty and the kinds of forms of dispossession and erasure that's premised on, right? This is why when I say land acknowledgements, I say the United States, that dispossession is the condition of possibility for settler states. Recognition and misrecognition, that's a really lovely dynamic that has layers and layers of meaning, which I'll get into a little more later. And when Simpson talks about the limits of anthropological and political scientific engagements with Indigenous politics, she's really problematizing the history of these disciplines and the way they've conceptualized what it means to be Indigenous. And she's intervening in order to articulate an alternative kind of anthropology that's grounded in Mohawk perspectives, and that is more than just describing Mohawk ways of life, and rather about accounting for Mohawk forms of sovereignty of political life that exceed the limits of settler states. If there is one thing that this book is known for, it's this concept of refusal. This is such a core move and such a valuable contribution that Simpson has made to anthropology. Now, refusal can mean a few different things. In the later chapter, she'll talk about ethnographic refusals, the refusal to represent certain parts of Mohawk life, and the kinds of political motivations that inform those refusals. But the core concept of refusal can really be articulated by this moment in 2010, when the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team dropped out of a world tournament that was being held in England. And the team was trying to travel to England to participate, as they had done for decades beforehand. But they were refused entry into England because they were using Haudenosaunee passports, and England wasn't going to recognize those passports as legitimate. Now, Canada and the United States both offered the players expedited passports so they could continue to compete. But the team members actually refused those passports. And they said, if we're not going to travel on Haudenosaunee passports, we're not going to travel. We're not going to travel on U.S. or Canada passports because we are Haudenosaunee people and our nation matters. And so the dynamic here, right, is a refusal of the privileges and rights granted by citizenship within these settler states, Canada and the United States. A refusal of settler citizenship that insists on the integrity of Haudenosaunee nationhood, Haudenosaunee sovereignty. And so they ended up not competing, and the next year they were at the bottom of the rankings because they hadn't competed. And the irony being that lacrosse is based on, it's developed from an indigenous game that was played widely in across the region, but very much in Iroquois communities, called stickball. And lacrosse is actually a particularly Iroquoian variant of stickball. And so news media during this time reported over and over again, right, this dynamic where the team from the indigenous nation that had invented this sport was not being allowed to compete because of this issue with the passports. So what is a refusal? A refusal is an act of saying no. It's an act of saying no to the terms of recognition dictated by settler states. It's the team members saying, no, we aren't going to travel in a way in which we're being recognized as citizens of the U.S. or Canada. We're going to travel being recognized as members of the sovereign nation of Haudenosaunee, or not at all. Now, to explain why this concept of refusal matters, I need to teach you guys a little bit about settler colonialism and how scholars like Audrey Simpson understand settler colonialism. Simpson draws heavily on Patrick Wolfe. Patrick Wolfe is a scholar who creates a canon within settler colonial studies and indigenous studies. Or he's a I shouldn't say he creates the canon. He is canonical for his definition of settler colonialism. So I'm going to get to the definition itself in a couple slides, but the next slide. But before that, I want to talk about the kinds of underlying considerations that he's working through. One of the famous quotes from his essay, which is Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, in which he really defines these concepts. One of the quotes that gets picked up a lot is, invasion is a structure, not an event. And what he's saying here is that settler colonialism is not just a bad thing that happened a long time ago. It's not something that we can look and say, oh, it's regretful that happened. That was really violent. That genocide was bad. And it's a good thing that it's over now, and we live in a better society now, that we live in a multicultural society now. For Patrick Wolfe, settler colonialism is not something that happened a long time ago. It's an organizing principle of social relations. It's an organizing principle of nation states, like specific nation states like the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Israel. And so he's saying it's not a thing that happened a long time ago. It's an organizing principle of social relationships. It's something that shapes our lives in intimate ways in the here and now. Settler colonialism has not gone anywhere. It's still here. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. What he means by this is the idea that settler colonialism destroys indigenous societies and political systems in order to replace them with a settler society. And settler colonialism is primarily motivated by territory. That means that the underlying driving factors for settler colonialism is the accumulation of indigenous land. Because the need is for that land in order to build a settler society, to destroy the people who live on that land base in order to build and replace them with a settler society. And so this is really about territory. It's about land. And all the other dynamics that we think about in terms of settler colonialism are secondary motivations that legitimize or support or help reproduce that territory dynamic. And Patrick Wolf quotes Deborah Bird Rose, who has this thing that she says, which is, to get in the way of settler colonialism, all the native has to do is stay home. Again, this brings our attention to land, to territory. So for Patrick Wolf, when Patrick Wolf defines what is settler colonialism, what is the structure? If it's not an event, what is the structure? The structure boils down to two core components: a relation of dispossession and a logic of elimination. So what does that mean? Dispossession refers to the appropriation of indigenous land. This is the heart of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a social and political system that is premised on the dispossession of indigenous land. And so that foundational relationship is between indigenous peoples as dispossessed and settlers as the people doing the dispossession, appropriating that land. That's the foundation of settler colonialism as a social system. The second piece is this logic of elimination. In order to, Patrick Wolf kind of points out, right, like in order to dispossess people's land, they might resist that. So elimination is a process that reproduces, it legitimizes the dynamic of land dispossession. And elimination can mean different things. It can mean physical genocide. It can mean forced displacement along death marches like the Trail of Tears. It can mean forced assimilation. For example, taking indigenous children and enrolling them into boarding schools, which sound nice. I mean, schools sound nice, but when we're talking about boarding schools, we're talking about places of systematic child abuse, in which a lot of people died in very traumatic spaces and abusive spaces that were really based on beating indigenous people's languages and ways of life out of them, physically beating it out of them, in order to make them proper citizens of these settler states. This same kind of dynamic continues to this day with the systematic adoption of indigenous children out of indigenous families and into white families. This is something that Maine recently held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission looking at cases of how this has been done since the 1970s to, I think the most recent case was in the early 2000s. Early 2010s. Canada has a court case going right now about sterilization of indigenous women. The most recent case of that was 2018. These are all practices of eliminating indigenous peoples, whether through genocide, through forced sterilization, through forced assimilation. The other way elimination can work is symbolically, through erasure. The erasure of indigenous peoples in high school curriculum after, probably like 16-something. The erasure of indigenous peoples from public consciousness, right? We have sports teams with racist names. Actually, racist isn't strong enough because it's specifically settler colonial names. But an erasure of actual indigenous peoples, right? So this erasure from public consciousness. And what that does is it makes the land dispossession appear normal and natural. Because if indigenous peoples are all gone, there's no one to challenge that land dispossession. And Patrick Wolf's point, right, when he talks about settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, his argument is that these logics need to be reproduced every day for settler states to continue to exist. If the United States was not to reproduce that relationship of dispossession for a single day, it could not exist as a political entity, as a legal entity, because it's premised on the appropriation of indigenous land. That's the founding logic of the United States of Canada as settler states. And that land acknowledgement is justified and enacted and legitimized through these logics of elimination, both physical, cultural, and symbolic. Another piece of Patrick Wolf's theory that's really useful is what he calls the triangle of settler colonialism. Basically, his point here is that there's three axes within the relationships that are within what he calls settler colonialism as a kind of social relation, as a organizing principle of society. Essentially, there are settlers, there are indigenous people, and there are slaves. This is about ownership, land, and labor. Indigenous peoples are dispossessed, as I've been saying, in this process of accumulating land for settler states to establish themselves. And that land comes to be owned by settlers, right? So that's the indigenous settler, the dispossession relationship, right? The ownership versus dispossession of settler versus indigenous. But then there's also the labor needed to work that land. And through this you have the capture of African peoples and transformation of peoples into chattel in order to enslave peoples and work land in order to produce wealth. Now, Patrick Wolf mostly talks about enslaved peoples, but we can also talk about migrant workers. There are many kinds of labor, right? But we have this kind of core dynamic of indigenous settler slave at the heart of his theory. And I think this is especially useful because it helps us think through the relationship between Sean Jay's critique of the state and Simpson's. By giving us a sense, how do we relate indigeneity, settler colonialism, how do we relate settler colonialism and the plantation? So for Patrick Wolf, as I said, settler colonialism is a relationship of dispossession and a logic of elimination. However, something really shifted in the 1960s and the 1970s. And this shift happened as a result of indigenous political organizing, what's called the Red Power movement. This is a picture of the occupation of Alcatraz, which was a famous historical event in which several indigenous organizations basically took over Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay Area and maintained it, right? I'm trying not to go too deep into it because I could talk about this out for hours. It's a super interesting event, very much worth researching. This is just an example of the Red Power movement, though. And the Red Power movement put pressure on the United States and Canada in order to accommodate indigenous peoples, right? The Red Power movement was really focused in a lot of ways on saying things like respect treaty rights. Respect treaty rights and respect our rights to self-determine as sovereign peoples, as sovereign nations. And so this, in order to accommodate these movements, the United States and Canada are really forced to shift their policies in fundamental ways. And this creates a new era in policy, what's often called the era of self-determination, or the era of recognition. Now, the idea here is that the U.S. and Canada, these settler states, grant recognition to certain indigenous nations. It says, we recognize that you have historically had a nation-to-nation relationship with our government. We recognize that we have treaty obligations to you. And we recognize that you are a distinctive people. And we will give you certain resources and rights to self-govern. This is really a shift in policy that shifts from previous efforts at eliminating indigenous peoples and actually starts dedicating resources to strengthening tribal governments, strengthening self-governance. And in many ways, this was a positive thing. But in other ways, similar to the way Sean Jay asks, if this is a progressive win, who loses? So what's the loss here? So indigenous governments are supported both legally and through legally as well as through economic resources. But to be recognized, they have to be recognized by the settler state as an indigenous people who should get those kinds of rights and resources. In order to do this, indigenous peoples have to simultaneously prove that they're culturally distinctive, while also proving that they have to prove that they have a form of government, self-government, that can be supported through this the model of what the United States or Canada consider governments to look at. And as a result, you have these tribal governments that end up having to reproduce the kinds of bureaucratic forms, the bureaucratic logics of the settler state, to the point of even the kinds of structure and organization of departments has to be very similar. So the thing about this politics of recognition is that indigenous people have to be recognized. They have to make themselves recognizable in order to be allocated these rights. So this poses several contradictions that Simpson takes up. The first one is what gives settler states the right to recognize or withhold recognition of indigenous peoples. The second piece is if these settler states are recognizing indigenous peoples as culturally distinctive peoples with certain treaty rights. The second piece then is the counter piece of that is what kinds of political forms are unrecognizable to the settler state. How do indigenous peoples have to transform their politics in order to be recognizable to the settler state? And how can we understand that as a kind of violence? The third piece for Audrey Simpson is that I'm blanking on it. I'll come back to it. The third piece is that these settler states can accommodate indigenous movements to a certain extent, but they also have to continue reproducing that relationship of land dispossession if they are going to exist. And so settler states can recognize indigenous peoples to the extent that recognition allows them to reproduce that relationship of land dispossession, that it allows them to reproduce that relationship of land theft. And so there are always limits to how far settler states can recognize. There's a beautiful example in another book about denamed social movements in Canada historically that foregrounded the construction of alternative political economies that were based on worker-controlled factories, syndicated factories, in which the Dene Nation sought to govern a chunk of land in what's currently called Canada that included both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. And of course, this is how governments operate, right? The Canada governs peoples of many different backgrounds and nationalities in many ways. Yet, for Canada, that was too far. Canada couldn't let the Dene Nation take it that far because it was a challenge to the kind of economic order of Canada. It was a challenge to capitalism. And it was a challenge to Canada's ability as a sovereign nation to govern people, and it was considered racist. That was the language used to talk about this move because it was believed to be racist settlers believed this to be racist if an indigenous nation could govern settlers, right? That was a race-based system of government. Now, I probably don't have to explain to all y'all how that's hypocritical, but we can see this logic, right? What are the limits of recognition? The limits have to do with with Canada as a settler state or the U.S. as a settler state being able to reproduce the kinds of core logics, the core social relationships of settler colonialism so that they can continue to exist. And so this dynamic of this policy of recognition, it doesn't replace elimination. It's rather, I would say, that both logics operate side by side today. But these practices, these policies of recognition and self-determination, increasing limited forms of self-determination, do shape indigenous politics in a lot of ways today. Because there's a lot of resources available. If the United States recognizes you, there's a lot you can do with that. There's another scholar, Glenn Coulthard. He's the scholar who talks about the DNA example that I talked about. He argues that recognition is really a practice of enticing indigenous peoples into settler colonialism, into accepting the relationship of land dispossession. It's a way of saying, hey, we'll give you this little bit if you accept the settler state and don't challenge the settler state's right to exist. If you don't challenge the fundamental political and economic order of the settler state. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about this concept that Audrey Simpson refers to as nested sovereignty. This is another concept that a lot of scholars pull out of her book that's really useful. Nested sovereignty refers to the ways in which we're talking about multiple sovereign nations that exist within one another. Haudenosaunee, Mohawk within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Canada, and the United States. And so in the politics of recognition, in these liberal politics of recognition that have emerged since the 1960s and 70s, the idea is that the U.S. and Canada can recognize a limited and encompassed form of sovereignty for indigenous peoples. Their sovereignty can exist as long as it can be encompassed within the larger apparatus of the settler state without challenging the settler state. But as Audrey Simpson's going to argue, this nested sovereignty actually is a bit more complicated. It works both ways. There's ways in which Haudenosaunee and Mohawk sovereignties can encompass the United States and Canada. And part of that is going to have to do with is an idea of settler precariousness, which I'll come back to later. And the idea is with nested sovereignty is that these multiple sovereignties in play don't necessarily negate each other, right? You do have multiple sovereign nations, but they are existing in tension. And just to return back, right, when we talk about dominant or mainstream systems of colonial law, indigenous peoples are recognized as sovereign nations within U.S. and Canadian law at this point in time. However, that sovereignty is limited. It's constrained. It's encompassed from the perspective of the United States and Canada. This is what creates problems, for example, in terms of Haudenosaunee people attempting to travel on Haudenosaunee passports. And so now that you have a little bit of a more complicated understanding of these concepts of sovereignty and settler colonialism and recognition, we can come back to refusal, right? What Audrey Simpson is arguing is that recognition and misrecognition are very closely related. And when we talk about recognition, settler colonial practices of recognition, we're also talking about logics of misrecognition, of misrecognizing indigenous politics, of not seeing indigenous politics, and instead creating very narrow boxes that indigenous peoples have to contort themselves to fit within in order to be recognizable to the settler state. And again, that's a kind of violence. This is what we can call the politics of recognition as a form of liberal, multicultural settler colonialism. It's multicultural in the sense that it's a kind of settler colonialism that makes space for for many different distinct peoples to maintain their cultures and what it is that makes them distinctive within the larger system of the settler state in a way that doesn't undermine the settler state's right to exist. We can incorporate more people into settler colonialism. We can incorporate diverse bodies into settler colonialism. That's what makes it liberal. That's what makes it multicultural. So when Simpson talks about refusal, she's talking about an alternative to this politics of recognition. She's talking about another path. It's about refusing recognition and insisting on being more than what the settler state can recognize. She describes this as a way of turning away from the settler state. I love this metaphor, this imagery of turning away from the settler state and asking what other kinds of life, what other kinds of social and political organization can exist when we turn away from the settler state and we turn towards indigenous forms of governance, indigenous philosophical, political philosophies and traditions of governance. And it's not a kind of binary thing, right? She's not looking for a kind of mythical, pure indigenous tradition that is culturally different from settler colonialism, that it's fundamentally like not modern, that's opposed to the modern. Instead, she's interested in Mohawk peoples, as they exist today, being able to self-determine their own lives. This is about insisting on indigenous nations that predate settler states. It's about indigenous political traditions that predate settler states. These traditions are dynamic, right, in the sense that, like, Haudenosaunee political philosophy from 1500 Common Era offers important teachings for contemporary political philosophy, but, they're not the same. The needs and concerns are not the same. So these philosophical traditions are dynamic. They're changing. They're adaptable. In the same way, Eurocentric political philosophies are. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a few different kinds of concepts, right? Because one of the things that I've been using is this idea of indigenous peoples as nations. Just to offer a little bit of more context for that, when I use this language, first of all, Audrey Simpson is very interested in this kind of process of nationhood and what counts as a nationhood, what counts as a nation, and who decides, where do you draw the limits, who is considered a member, who's not considered a member, who has citizenship. These are all questions that deeply inform her work. But the other piece of it is, for a lot of Indigenous studies scholars don't like the concept of nation because they think that's already a Eurocentric political form. Some people talk about kinship. There's many different ways people talk about these things in Indigenous studies. But Simpson does use the word nation, which is very common in Indigenous communities, especially in Canada. It's just not uncontested. But what she is trying to do with this idea of refusal is build on a literature that's really about, build on a kind of tradition in scholarship that's about imagining or theorizing forms of indigenous self-determination, forms of indigenous nationhood that are not identical to the nation-state, that don't just mirror the nation-state but do something different. Often things that get critiqued within these kinds of models of the nation-state are the idea of borders, the idea of a nation as being defined by a set of territorial borders. And that's something that Audra Simpson is going to come back to in a later chapter and challenge. Now, one of my favorite concepts from this book is what Audra Simpson calls settler precariousness. This is the idea that settler colonialism, even though it appears to be inevitable and stable and defined, it's actually quite precarious. As she says, settler precariousness, right? This is a precarious assumption that the boundaries of settler states are permanent, uncontestable, and entrenched. It's the idea that it's the presumption that the colonial project has been realized, that the land has already been dispossessed, its landowners have been eliminated or absorbed, right? And she has this lovely metaphor, right, at the beginning of the quote I just read. Apparently I'm going to read it in backwards order, is that in her critique of anthropology and political science, she says that they haven't adequately dealt with indigenous politics and how indigenous politics challenges what most have perceived as settled. And I love this language, what most have perceived as settled, because there's a kind of pun that she's making there. This is the idea that the colonial project is realized, that it's complete, that it's a finished business. And what she's saying is that the world is not nearly so settled as that. That things are far more contested and up in the air. Circling back around, right? When I said earlier that the foundations of the settler state are dispossession and elimination, what this means is that that settler colonialism is founded on the assumption that indigenous peoples are not here. This is why no longer exist. This is why land acknowledgements are important. They're problematic. Land acknowledgements are problematic in ways I'm going to talk about in future classes. But what they do is recognize that indigenous peoples are still here. And this simple fact, right, indigenous peoples exist, radically transforms the founding premises of the settler colonial project. Because that founding premise is the elimination, the disappearance of indigenous peoples. I had a student at Brandeis who put together a zine to advance student organizing. She was bringing together students to try and establish and institutionalize indigenous studies. And she drew on an article that has this lovely quote that says, "The meaningful of Native American studies stems from the fact that it challenges almost everything that America has to offer in education and society." What Audrey Simpson and what Rachel are saying here is that once we put indigenous politics front and center, it undermines everything that we take for granted in the settler state. It undermines what settler states have to offer in terms of education and society, because those things are premised on the fundamentally incorrect assumption that indigenous peoples no longer exist. And what a precarious set of assumptions to found a social order on. And so when Audrey Simpson talks about refusal, she's talking about an alternative to this liberal, this multicultural practice of recognition that has taken off since the 60s and 70s. And she's calling for a way of imagining indigenous politics that undermines these core foundations of what we take for granted within settler states, that undermines these core foundations of the United States and Canada. As I've been saying, she's going to talk about borders, and I have these lovely pictures known as illegal unstolen land. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Right, once you acknowledge that once you acknowledge indigenous peoples exist, it radically transforms your understanding of politics, right? Because the politics of settler states is founded on the assumption that indigenous peoples don't exist. So one of these assumptions is the idea that the United States and Canada have any level of moral legitimacy to police borders that cut across indigenous land. When we can talk about, for example, concentration camps on the border, you have conservative perspectives and you have liberal perspectives within the settler state about these concentration camps. But both of these perspectives are fundamentally united, and they're in agreement in a fundamental way around the assumption that the United States does have the moral legitimacy to police its boundaries, to decide who is a citizen and who is not, to decide who can move where, who can cross the border and who can't. Even progressive movements that would call for open borders don't inherently challenge the assumption that the settler state has a right to exist. And so what Audrey Simpson is doing is she's offering us another lens that centers indigenous politics and undermines this consensus that's held between conservative, liberal, and progressive settler colonists, or colonial societies, or political frameworks. So what kinds of alternative political possibilities emerge when we turn away from the settler state and towards indigenous practices of governance? So those are the kinds of fundamental questions that I want to ask through this book. I've given you guys some discussion questions to work through on the forum discussion board. As always, if you're really wanting to talk about something that I'm not asking about, do it. Go for it. I love it. This is meant to provide structure, but if you want to go in a different direction, that's always great. One thing I do want to do right is this book is kind of dense in a lot of ways, especially the introduction. It'll be a little more straightforward as we get to more ethnographic empirical stuff. But one way to deal with this kind of material is to focus on the ethnographic stories that the author uses to illustrate and unpack their argument. So tell me about the ethnographic material, the signposts in the sections, discuss that, and how these stories that this ethnographic material, the concrete empirical stuff, helps illustrate her points, her underlying concepts of sovereignty, nation, citizenship, recognition, and misrecognition. It'd also be interesting to think about how this material relates back to Sean Jay's book, particularly in terms of the relationship between the state as an anti-black formation and as a settler colonial formation. The relationship between the plantation and the settler colonialism. All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday.